All right, everybody. I know this is much longer than what we anticipated as far as having to do. It's not really virtual classes, but in essence, video. But I did want to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be getting into. And then also, I want to touch on your assignment that you will be having because it's important that you know what to expect when we get back to the classroom, whether it be later this week or next week. But either way. So the next thing we're actually going to get into will be the theories themselves. I may not spend a whole lot of time on every single theory, but what I want you to get is the general concept of each category. Right. So what we're going to start off with first would be like I said, as you can see this rationale for criminal behavior. We're going to focus on, in essence, biology, or some people might call it physiobiology. Okay. We'll also talk a little bit about the biosocial factor. So it's not just biology. According to some, it would also be combining biology with social factors, right? And that's more of the modern approach. And that's what I want to focus the most attention on rather than going through all the older theories. There are some people I want to touch on and some ideas I want to touch on, but ultimately I want to get to this concept of the modern view of these theories. So just to take us a little stroll through what we want to talk about, this is what we're eventually going to get into. But for example, when we go into the earlier things, like I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each of these older theories, but this concept of phrenology, it was introduced and probably made the most famous by, as you can see here, Franz Joseph Gall. He believed that the body itself, especially the skull, gave a lot of information about someone's personality, or what type of mentality they would have. Basically, he and his own idea had his own idea about what different parts of the brain function in different ways. So, like, essentially, if you had bumps on your head in the area that would deal more so with melancholy, or we might call it depression, if that area seemed to be larger simply by touching someone's skull and feeling that area, he thought that the size of that area relative to the rest of the brain or the rest of the skull would indicate that someone's more likely to struggle with or suffer from depression. Same thing goes with violent behavior, or anything along those lines. That was the idea of phrenology, is this concept of the size of or bumps on the skull indicate the relative size of the brain for that region, and then those bigger regions had more of an influence, right? So, like I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. If you guys want to watch some of that, you can. Not through this video. I have to go through the actual PowerPoint that I'll also make available. But this is already things I've talked about, and so I don't really think it's necessary to go on or spend a whole lot of extra time on Gall and what he believed. I think it's a good idea to kind of touch up on this for your own sake and get an idea of who did what, because it helps you get a better understanding of where it came from and now where we are with today's views on things. So Henry Maudsley was another guy who he believed more so it's still considered biological in essence, but he believed that in essence, as you can read here, insanity and criminal behavior were strongly linked, meaning essentially that people, the best way that they could deal with any issues they had, like mental problems, they didn't at that time, they didn't have definitive ways of explaining the different mental illnesses, didn't break it up into as many different possibilities that we have now. And even today, I think there's a lot that we can learn, because I think some of it's been misguided. But either way, he thought essentially that some people, to relieve stress, some people go, they'll play sports, they'll play video games, read, you name it. Everybody has their own activity they enjoy that kind of relieves stress or strain. And according to Maudsley, he thought these people out here, these, in essence, we would call them criminals, the only way that they could really, that they either knew of, or the only way that made sense to them to let that either anger or anxiousness out was to commit crimes, whether it be violent crime, especially is more so what he's talking about, but still also other crimes too. So that's Maudsley thinking. Essentially, someone commits crimes to keep themselves from going, he might call it insane or mad, or that's basically, we would say, to control different urges or to control their uh, mental health. They would go ahead and let themselves relieve some of that stress by committing crimes. Okay, so and then Cesar or Cesare Lombroso, if you really want to talk about it and pronounce it correctly, Cesare, um, he had this concept that an Italian physician would look at bodies of either prisoners or people who had been executed. Even during wartime, you could look at those who were, in essence, more deviant. Um, and he would kind of compare different features, hand size, facial structures, things like that. And he believed there are certain structures that made people to be more likely to be criminal. Um, for example, he thought that those who had more of a bigger athletic build, that made them a little bit more likely to be violent criminals, in essence, or more susceptible to that. So he also thought things like, say, thin lips or the narrow eyes or narrow distance between the eyes. Those are all things that he essentially developed, and we know today that's not necessarily the case. Um, there's other reasons behind some of that. For example, someone might say, "Oh, well, his idea of athleticism makes sense because if you see some of these people out here who are bigger and stronger, maybe they feel like they can get away with committing crimes against other people, especially physical or violent crimes, because they are simply bigger, more in essence, physically dominant." Okay, which could be part of it, but there's also so many more reasons behind it. So he got the idea, though, or he was the main proponent for a biological difference in terms of being a born criminal. He believed the fact that people could be born criminals, and in essence, if your parents were criminals, genetically speaking, you would be much more likely to be a criminal. So we'll get into that later during discussion when we can actually talk in person. But you guys can read through these on your own. I basically told you all this stuff already. But let's see here. Anything I missed out on? There were some things that he pointed to which indicated some things that they believed to be biologically connected, such as insanity, syphilis, and alcoholism. We can talk about that once again in person. But essentially, what you do find is, obviously, there's a connection between insanity and some criminal behavior, which we would later consider to be, psychopathy potentially, or sociopathic behavior. But then also this down here, syphilis. People don't realize this, but syphilis, if untreated, can actually start to affect the brain and how it functions and how you really see the world around you. So back in centuries and years ago, they basically didn't have a proper treatment for syphilis, and it could get to that point. In fact, back whenever they used more lead-based products, in addition to syphilis, when you add that to lead poisoning they would get from the drinking vessels, in essence, goblets or cups they were using, essentially people were getting a combination of syphilis and lead poisoning, and those two combined, both of them affect the brain after a certain point in time. So that's actually, besides other problems, that's what they believe could have been problems with. If you want to go far enough back in history, they talk about some of the problems that you had with, like, say, Caligula, with the Roman Empire, Nero, some of those people that you may have heard more infamous or notorious things about. They think, besides other problems that could have factored into their poor decision making, which I think ultimately it's a personal decision, but a lot of them made decisions that you and I would consider to be heinous and just unspeakable, in essence. But they made those decisions partly because of people they were in general, but also the idea of how the brain could be affected by lead poisoning and syphilis. Alcoholism does. We'll actually talk about that because it's mentioned in part of your one of the videos I'm going to require that you watch while we're not in class. So, all right. So here's kind of where I want to stop on some of this, because what I want to do is show you when we talk about Dr. Rain, it's Adrian Rain, and he's the more modern viewpoint on all of this. And so he calls it neurocriminology. And I want you to learn kind of a little bit more about him on your own. But there are two videos I'm going to provide links to, not in this video, but in subsequent announcements, and also the PowerPoint itself. Once I actually allow you put that up and update it, it's going to have two different. I'm going to see if I can get out of here for you. Essentially, there are two different videos that I want you to watch. And yes, they're longer, but guess what? We're not in class, so we can't really, we would be discussing basically these same topics. But I want you to be able to watch the two videos, like I said, predicting antisocial behavior. It's kind of interesting what you can learn from that, as well as the neurobiology of violence. Okay, because he wrote a book, Dr. Rain did, about he called it the anatomy of violence. In essence, how the brain structure, how it operates, things like that, can factor into violent behavior. And that's something that I want you to not just watch it. I actually want you to watch these, be able to take notes, because I expect you, don't be surprised if we have a quiz or some type of assignment when you return, because it's very likely. Let's put it that way. But watch it. If you have to watch it a couple times, or each of them a couple times, or whatever, review it, that's fine. I want you to be aware of it so you have questions. If you have questions for me, you can ask them. Bring up to the class. And also, like I said, when we have an assignment pertaining to this, I want you to be prepared for it. So, and Dr. Rain is in essence the authority when it comes to neurocriminology, and what we would call in terms of theory, as we look forward, this would be considered the biosocial theory. So either way, I want you to be aware of this. I will probably, if I need to put up other videos, I will. But just be looking at these. Like I said, use the links that I provide, and be ready to discuss them. Be ready for any type of quiz or assignment we'd be having over that. So you should have time to take care of it. Be safe, and I will talk to you later.